So I'm a Christian, and I assume you're a skeptic. My goal is to explain why I think Christians are justified in thinking that the Gospel of John relates true events in a truthful way. Now, I already published a main video for the John for Skeptics series on the authorship of John, where I just stated very briefly my reasons for holding to the traditional Christian view of the authorship of John. Surprise, surprise. But in this longer video, I kind of want to get into the weeds and do three things. First, I want to provide a more detailed argument in support of the traditional conclusion. Two, I want to explain and refute the general trend lines of the non-traditional views of authorship. And then three, I want to explain in a kind of appendix why I think it's most likely that chapter 21 was part of the original composition of John. If you didn't know, many scholars think, or at least doubt, that the end of John 21 belongs with the original composition of John. They think it was interpolated or added later. There's no manuscript for support for this, really, but nonetheless, there are arguments which I'll go through a little bit at the end of the video, as I said, as a kind of appendix. Now, these arguments are not, of course, a full scholarly treatment or anything of the question. They're just an outline, more or less, of some of the main lines of thinking that inform my opinions the most. And I think the challenge for the skeptic is to be as skeptical toward the critical, what's called critical scholarship, their ways of reading the evidence as you might be toward the traditional Christian view. Now, to be clear, I think it's pretty obvious that both sides are guilty of confirmation bias. Atheists are right that Christians like me, though I was formerly an atheist, are drinking the Kool-Aid. I think that's true. And we tend to find the evidence or see the evidence we want to see to support our view. It's very hard to get away from that. But it's also true, I think, and I think it's also obvious, that the non-believing, agnostic and liberal Christian scholars even are sort of sniffing mushrooms. So that said, I think all scholars are at times, of course, very objective, and I'm really grateful for my own background, which is primarily in classics, but I'm grateful for the biblical scholars that I've interacted with quite a bit over the years. And I think both the believing and the non-believing, or the traditional and non-traditional, liberal, however you want to describe it, different scholars, I think all of them, there's great work and there's much to learn and to continue to learn from both sides. So if you're looking for sort of a hack fest, this is not the right video for you. For clarity, my own background, as I said, is classics. And but I did do a lot of work in biblical literature as well, even in my university years. Really grateful for the professors I had, and almost all of them were more on the agnostic sort of side, or maybe at best liberal Christian side, as far as their understandings of the Bible and the way they approach their scholarship. Now, a nice neutral way to describe the various theories about the authorship of John is by referring to them as the one author, two author, three author, four author, believe it or not, or more theories. Okay. Now, if this were sort of a journal article, then I'd be a little more precise and neutral in my terminology. But it's just a YouTube video, and I'm kind of wanting to just look at it as I see it, without getting into a ton of scholarship. And so I'm just going to refer to two views. There's the traditional view, obviously held by conservative Christians, evangelical Christians, and so on. Not only them, but primarily them. And then there's the critical or non-traditional view, which many non-believing agnostic scholars that work on the Bible, and of course liberal Christian scholars. And I don't mean any of those terms really to be overly loaded. I just mean there's a traditional Christian view, and then there's the modern non-traditional view. And this is just for convenience sake. Now, the traditional Christian view is that a single author, a disciple of Jesus called the beloved disciple in the gospel itself, not only authored the entire gospel, or at least 99% of the gospel, but identifies himself as the single author and an eyewitness to the events that he describes. So that's the traditional view. The critical view is usually that there were between 2 to 4, usually 3 to 4 authors, none of whom were disciples of Jesus, none of whom were eyewitnesses, and may not have even had any real direct contact with Jesus' disciples or any eyewitnesses to Jesus' ministry. Now, what we're going to do is first look at the external evidence, pretty standard approach. All the evidence that is, outside of the actual content of the Gospel of John, and then we'll go on and look at the internal evidence, all of the actual content of the book, and we'll just sort of see where the two lines of evidence point. Now, as far as the external evidence, I think it's Ehrman who likes to say not just that the Gospels are anonymous, although we'll talk about John in particular, but not just that John's anonymous, but, quote, completely anonymous, end quote. I'm not sure what that means, but completely anonymous. So just a quick response to this sort of idea. Yes, it's obvious to anyone who's read the Gospels that the actual name of the author of any of these four Gospels is clearly absent from the at least the preface and the conclusion of these Gospels. Okay, so that's pretty obvious, and in that sense, they're anonymous, right? The name's not included, but there are a ton of biographies, classical biographies, by say Nepos or Plutarch. I think Polybius is also, there's a ton anyway. Arrian, for sure, who wrote the history of the Alexandrian campaigns. There's a ton of classical history and biographies where the name of the author is not included in the work. That's not particularly a great point to make as far as I can see, at least not from my background. So anonymous can mean, yes, it doesn't have a name, but anonymous doesn't mean that the author's identity was unknown or was controversial. All the works I just cited, there was no controversy about these works, and yet the names of the authors aren't in the actual book. Now, sometimes the authors will identify themselves without their name, like Tacitus at one point in writing the Agricola refers to the theme of his work, the Agricola, as his father-in-law, but he never includes his name, but he refers to him as his father-in-law, so sort of a way of identifying him. To me, it's, really, honestly, if you go into, say, Wikipedia, and you go for yourself, look up Nepos, or look up Arrian, okay, or Florus, another historian, and the epitome of Roman history, and you go look at the descriptions of their works and of the authorship of their works, and you'll find dead silence. At least I don't think I've looked them all up. I'm just predicting dead silence on any controversies about the authorship that they are assumed to have had, for good reasons, I think, of these works. Even though their names aren't in there, there's just no discussion about it. I mean, it's helpful to have the name. Everybody agrees it's helpful to have a name, but it's not as though the lack of a name is really telling us much. Now, all of the manuscripts of the Gospel of John, the ones that identify the author, unanimously claim that the name of this book was John. Okay, and some of these manuscripts are very early, from around 200 A.D. The earliest fathers, okay, and there's quite a few of them. There's Irenaeus and the Muratorian fragment, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Theophilus of Antioch. I'm sure I'm missing some. Polycrates, Heraclion, I'm pretty sure has a comment. Anyway, there's a number of writers who are between, say, 175 and 200 A.D., all of whom identify the author of the Gospel of John as John, or as the beloved disciple, the character in John, that character within the Gospel. Okay, so as far as I can tell, there's zero chance that all these diverse people held this view, which came about in only right before they all started to write in the sort of the last quarter of the century, of the second century. So it just has to take some time for that idea to catch on and be spread around in so many places. So Papias, there's some real interesting argument by Charles Hill, who I think is really clever and good argument. Actually, it's stronger than I was expecting it to be. That Eusebius is making use of Papias for his comments on the authorship of the Gospel of John, and that it's clear then that Papias also held John to be the beloved disciple named John, to be the author of the work. And of course, Papias is writing at the very beginning of the 2nd century. Eusebius seems to me to date him, in the early part of Trajan's reign. So I mean, probably 110 at the latest. This is a huge array of people in the 2nd century, and of course, the gospel is most people's view is that the gospel was not really written until the 90s or closer to 100 AD, published around that time anyway. Now, the critical view, the non-traditional view, will emphasize that this evidence is mostly, sometimes you'll hear this on the sort of maximized, 100 or so years after the gospel was published, and therefore it's not very reliable. But as I just said, that's really not true. It's be more fair to say there's some probable evidence very early in the 2nd century, then there's some pretty good evidence in the middle of the 2nd century, and then there's just a Niagara Falls of evidence at the end of the 2nd century. Okay, so that's a more accurate way to sort of cast all the external evidence. And of course, Irenaeus actually says specifically that he knew Polycarp. He listened to Polycarp when he was young, and that Polycarp, being a disciple of John, used to sort of regale them with stories of things John the Evangelist said. So, I mean, Irenaeus, this isn't really that far, in chronologically, it's not that far removed from the death of John, which is at the end of the 1st century. So, it seems to me that's a pretty powerful piece of evidence of connecting, personally to the author. But I'm always sort of amazed at how some scholars, many scholars actually, can find a confident reason to dismiss this kind of evidence, the statements, say, of Irenaeus. And the general line of thinking, as I hear it, is, I think I can think of a motivation that Irenaeus may have had to lie about his personal connection to Polycarp, and therefore he lied. That you might want to go take a philosophy course in syllogisms, but that's not a very good way to reach your conclusion. I mean, so anyway, I'm always sort of impressed with how some really key evidence just is so quickly and confidently. I mean, look, is it plausible that Irenaeus is cooking the books in some way, that his connection to Polycarp? I mean, it's plausible. It's not outrageous or anything, but it's also completely, in the context, doesn't seem to me like it's that crucial. That little point is it's not like he built his whole book against the heresies around that one little scene where he's sitting at the feet of Polycarp. So, again, I think that's at least a balanced way to look at it, not so confident. And I just, basically just think he lied, Okay. So, Simon Gathercall is really, I think that's how you pronounce his name, has a real interesting question that he raises. I sort of alluded to it earlier, which is, the letter to the Hebrews also does not have a name prefix to its beginning. There's no clear named author in the book. And there's actually already in the early church multiple attributions to different authors. The Apostle Paul, Clement, Luke, Barnabas, says Tertullian. And so there's a variety of people that are claimed to have potentially written this book or to have written this book. So why isn't that the case with John? If it was truly unknown, why wouldn't there be multiple attributions, or at least two? Why such a unanimous array of external evidence as far back as we can go? It's just unanimous. My conclusion is that the evidence is just too early. It's too diverse. It's too varied, and it's simply too unanimous, if you can say that, that the author was, in fact, a disciple of Jesus named John, and thus an eyewitness to the events described in the book. I mean, that's the point is that's the view, that's the claim that people had from the external evidence. Now, I'll add that the skeptics of this conclusion, then, they bear a very heavy burden to explain away all of this evidence. For my part, I have a very high degree of confidence that were this just a classical author, there would just be zero controversy. Okay, so let's look at the internal evidence now. Maybe the external evidence is really good, but we have reasons to modify our confidence or dump all the external evidence that's provided to us based on some internal evidence. And actually, that's where some scholars will go, as they rely more heavily on the internal evidence as a basis for deciding the core question about authorship. But of course, this evidence is going to arise from narrative criticism, from literary methods of interpreting the text, which a lot of people will say is more subjective. Of course, I think there's truth to that, but it's not as though it's completely subjective either. So let's just keep that in mind. That's the footing we're on now in looking at just the internal evidence. And my impression is that the critical scholars rely more heavily on the internal evidence for obvious reasons, because the external evidence, I think, is so much stronger in the direction of John being the author. Now, it's noteworthy to start that the earliest commentators on the Gospel of John, so these are roughly around 400 AD, most of them, or I think all of these I'm going to list, but they're the ones who we have the first commentaries, on the book. And again, it's a unanimous testimony. Theodore of Mopsuestia, Cyril of Alexandria, Chrysostom, St. Augustine, all of them comment at length on the authorship of John and how they read the internal statements of the book about the author, their statements within the book, as we'll see, about the authorship. So how do they read these statements? And it's a unanimous way of reading these statements. In other words, for them, it seems like the traditional view is the most natural way to read it. As far as I know, I haven't come across a single commenter on the Gospel of John among the earliest fathers or the early fathers who read the Gospel of John's statements about authorship within the book the same way modern critical scholars or the non-traditional scholars. Furthermore, I see that there's no theological barrier or incentive, at least to some of the theories of critical scholarship. In other words, there are some ways you could read the statements about scholarship. There's certainly conservative Christian scholars even who will adopt some of the ways of reading the statements within John about the author, but more or less still think the majority of the book was written by this disciple named John. So it's not as though it's some massive threat to make some adopt some of the ways that you could read the book the way modern critical scholarship does, but in actual fact, none of these early fathers read the book that way, or at least so far as I know. You can fill the comment sections if you know of someone who doesn't. I'm happy to learn about them. So before surveying the internal evidence, I'd just like to establish three really common ways in which classical authors wrote. Sorry, not three, two. Two habits they had. All right, number one. And by the way, these are so common that just earning a bachelor's degree in classics, you would easily imbibe these two practices. Number one, authors would customarily sign on to their work and or sign off from their work by identifying themselves, by identifying their relationship to their work, their composition, and or the nature of that composition. Okay, so they could do all of these three things or one or two of these three things. Okay, so this is so well established that any ancient reader would anticipate that's what an author is going to do. And then number two, authors regularly referred to themselves in one of three ways. Okay, so three ways of referencing themselves. Number one, they would use a third person singular, he or Thucydides or Herodotus. They refer to themselves the way professional athletes will say and talk about themselves in the third person singular. Second, first person plural. They would say we or us, even though they're referring to themselves. And number three, first person singular, where they just refer to themselves as I or me. These are three different ways they could reference themselves, and regularly mixed and matched. So they could do as we're going to see, they could do all three. In order to illustrate this, I'm just going to show you the beginning of, or at least a few statements from Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian Wars. It's mainly from the prologue, but there's one reference, I think, from later, but you'll see why. So again, this is just, you imagine you're sitting in a classical course with me, and we're reading Thucydides, okay? It starts by saying, Thucydides, an Athenian, wrote the history of the war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians. Now keep in mind, if you're sitting in a classics course, this isn't an author writing about Thucydides. This is Thucydides who wrote those words about himself, even though it sounds as if he's talking about someone else. All right, then he says a little bit farther, just a tiny bit farther, the evidence which an inquiry leads me to trust all points to the conclusion that there was nothing on a great scale, blah, blah, blah. All right, so now notice he's using the first person singular, me. But he's just referred to himself as Thucydides. Okay, this is in the first paragraph of the work. And then we have, by the way, just to be clear, if you were to say in a classics course, oh, well, this must mean that Thucydides is a different person from the author, well, I wouldn't recommend you do that, okay? Because it's just so common. It'd be like you didn't know what you were talking about if you started to talk like that. All right, and then he says this farther in. Oh no, I'm sorry. This is still in the prologue. And the first person known to us by tradition as having established a navy is Minos. For I suppose if blah 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 Lacedaemon and blah blah blah. That's Sparta. So notice what he does here. The first person known to us. He's now talking in what's the first person plural. But that's still Thucydides. And then he says right after that, for I suppose. That's the colloquial expression I was saying. I suppose. By the way, that little word there, I suppose, is ime. That is, you might want to put that on the shelf because that's an exact expression John uses at the end of his book. So here we have this, in this little prologue, and granted I've taken out a few phrases and sentences, you've got all these different references, all self-references to the author, okay? Different ways he wrote about himself. And then I'll go farther into the book, into his history, to pick this one out for a reason you'll see later. Eucles, the general, sent to the other commander in Thrace, Thucydides, again referring to himself, who wrote these things. Now notice the narrator, which is Thucydides, is describing himself in the third person singular as Thucydides, and then he comments that who wrote these, meaning the historical work that we're reading right now, who wrote these things, okay? So again, absolutely zero controversy or skepticism at all in any of the scholarship I have ever come across or heard about. I challenge you to find an article that tries to say these are like 4 different authors writing this book. Now, as an ancient reader then, you would expect that the author is going to sign on or sign off from their work with information about themselves, the nature of their work, or their relationship to the work, or all 3 of those things, 2 or 1 of those things. And then that the authors may refer to themselves first person plural, first person singular, third person singular, okay? All these customs, normal. I just showed you. It couldn't be any more obvious. Okay, so what we need to do now is actually get into a survey of the Gospel of John, and let's read it through that lens. All right, so we begin with the very famous verse, chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Verse 3, all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. So this is a statement, of course, about the Logos, who made all things, who was with God, and who was God. And then we get in verse 14, the Word, this Word, right, became flesh, became a human. This Logos became a human, and dwelt among us. Now note that expression, among us. Okay, that's a first person plural, we or us. It is the author referencing himself. Okay, we just saw it in Thucydides. We could have shown you many other examples. It doesn't matter. So very common. And we another reference to the author, identifying themselves, and here their relationship to this narrative, to this account of the word of Jesus. Okay, and we have seen his glory of as of the only Son from the Father. Okay, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The dwelt means set up his tent, actually, among us, meaning it was temporary. And then we have seen. So the author. So again, notice an ancient reader is going to think, yeah, of course, the author at the beginning of their work is identifying themselves, the nature of their work, and or their relationship to the work. Here, the author is identifying themselves as an actual eyewitness. They have seen the Word walking around in the flesh. Okay, so this is a claim to be an eyewitness by the author, written in the first person plural. Okay, in other words, they're an eyewitness. To me, there is zero doubt that's exactly how an ancient reader would have understood it. And indeed, all of the earliest readers we know of read it exactly that way. Now, is the author including sort of the other disciples with him in the first person plural as sort of joining his eyewitness account? That's plausible, sure, perfectly plausible. Not going to fight over that. But the main point is that the author is who is being referred to here. Primarily, they have seen. They're an eyewitness. Okay, so that's early on in the book. You can't miss it. It's a reference to the author identifying themselves and their relationship to the work. The obvious implication is they're a disciple. That's not easy to see. It's not hard to see. All right, so you go ahead to the end of the chapter. Chapter 1 now we're in. Some of the earliest stories and the ministry of John the Baptizer and Jesus being baptized, or at least the record of him coming to the region for baptism and what happened at his baptism. And then in verse 35 it says this: the next day John the Baptizer was standing with two of his disciples. And he looked at Jesus as he walked, and he said, "Behold the Lamb of God." And the two disciples heard him, and they followed Jesus. Okay, and they went and stayed with him that night wherever his lodgings were. And verse 40 says, one of the two who heard John speak and followed Jesus was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. And then you go on to the story about Simon Peter's conversion. And there's no other reference to this other disciple. Okay, now, I'm not convinced at all that an ancient reader would immediately see that this other disciple, because you don't really need to mention another disciple, of course. You could have told the story and just told it as if it was just Andrew in the scene. There'd been another problem with that. But by including this other disciple but not naming him, okay, I'm just going to say I think it's plausible, because as we go through the book, it becomes more plausible, more probable that this is a reference to the actual author of the book. Now, you can totally reject that. I think it has no bearing on deciding what this book says about the author of the book, okay? So I think you could, in the end, completely reject what I'm just saying, but I think it's a pattern that we're going to see happen later. Now, the disciples then get to go travel with Jesus as he goes... Could you say that again? Siri. So the disciples then travel with Jesus as he goes from the Jordan River up to Galilee, and the author, I'm just going to refer to him as John. Not trying to make a big case. It's just because it's easier, because I know I'm going to say John anyway. So John is, or the author is saying that the disciples are going. Jesus is collecting disciples, so to speak, and going up to Galilee over a sequence of days. The next day, and then the next day something happens, and the next day, and then the third day from the final day. So it's about a week of time from the scene in the end of chapter 1. It says that there was this wedding, and look at what it says in verse 2, the wedding at Cana. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. Okay, so I think the writer is claiming, since he is, after all, an eyewitness and a disciple, I actually think he's referring to himself earlier there in chapter 1 as being at the Jordan River. He then is accompanying Jesus to the wedding reception. So he's able to describe what happens on this occasion when Jesus turns water to wine. And of course, at the end of the story, it says in verse 11, this is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him, because our author is an eyewitness, a disciple, and so he can tell you that the disciples came to believe in Jesus after watching this miracle. Now, verse 12 says, after this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples. So the disciple goes with him. And then after some time, a few days it says, there was this festival of the Jews, the Passover in chapter 2, the middle of chapter 2, and they all go up to Jerusalem. And Jesus cleanses the temple. And look what we're told in verse 17. His disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. You see, because our author is a disciple, he can tell you how the disciples responded to this. They remembered a verse from Scripture. And then Jesus talks about how he's going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, and there's confusion about that. And the author tells us that he was talking about the temple of his body in verse 21. And then he says, when therefore Jesus was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this. Because, of course, our author was there. He's one of the eyewitnesses. He's a disciple. And so he could tell you how the disciples reflected upon this event 2-3 years, or much longer, who knows how long it was, later, and connected this event to some Scripture. But again, this is the author reinforcing or validating that he was an eyewitness, he was a disciple, and therefore he can give us an account of this information. Then, while they're at the festival, Jesus has a conversation famously with Nicodemus in Jerusalem. They head out into the Judean countryside. Again, verse 22 of chapter 3, Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside. Note, by the way, none of the other evangelists are this particular about constantly narrating the disciples' presence along sort of the geographical travel of Jesus. There's references here and there to them being present, but not so much emphasis on them being with him as he moves from place to place. Okay, that's in John. It's unique to John. So they go out into the sort of the rural country around Jerusalem, and there's this huge controversy between John the Baptist's disciples and a Jew. So this doesn't involve the actual disciples who are following Jesus, although, remember I said earlier, I think that our author has already indicated he was following John the Baptizer with Andrew, and therefore he, at some point, presumably later, is privy to this controversy that happened among the disciples of John the Baptist, which he only recently has parted ways from and is now traveling with Jesus. Okay, so just a little piece of connection there to this event, and maybe that indicator at the end of chapter 1 there that he's next to Andrew when they first encountered Jesus at the Jordan River. Then, of course, they go into, they start to head north to Galilee after the feast, and they encounter the Samaritan woman, very famously encounter the Samaritan woman in Samaria, which is in between Jerusalem and Galilee. And what happens, but when the disciples come back from the city after having bought some food, and they discover Jesus is sitting next to this well talking to a woman who is alone, it says, verse 27, chapter 4, then his disciples came back, and they marveled that he was talking with a woman. But no one said, what are you seeking, or why are you talking with her? In other words, this author is able to share the doubts that the disciples had, because this author was present, over the motives of Jesus. It threw them off. Like, what is he doing talking to a lady alone? This doesn't make sense, and the author is able to share that with us. And then, of course, they have a discussion with Jesus about food and spiritual food and things like that. And then they end up going back all the way up to Galilee, and I'll spare you the miracle story that happens at the end of there. Then in chapter 5, there's another festival, and they go down. There's no mention, right, in this chapter at all of the disciples. Jesus goes up to Jerusalem, so presumably the disciples are going with him again, but there's no reference at all to the disciples. So there you go. Write a paper on that. Fine with me. When they come back up to Galilee, however, and Jesus feeds the 5,000 on their return trip, now you get a ton of references again to the disciples. Okay, there's large crowds following Jesus. He's going to feed the 5,000s. The disciples, of course, participate in the feeding the 5,000. They distribute the bread and so on. Then they end up going across the sea, and Jesus comes to them at night. I think these stories are so famous that we don't really need to go through them. The point is just simply that the disciples are there, and our author, who's claimed to be an eyewitness and disciple, is naturally placed at the event, and therefore can recount what happens. Jesus gets to the other side of the Sea of Galilee and preaches in the synagogue at Capernaum, very famous sermon called "I'm the Bread of Life," at the end of which we're told about the reaction of, guess who? The disciples. We're told that after this, many of his disciples, not the 12, of course, turn back, verse 66, and they no longer walk with him. And Jesus turns to the 12 apostles and he says, do you want to go away as well? And Peter says, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Okay, so the disciples are there. The next thing that happens, of course, another festival. And the disciples are going to go up. This time we're told in verse 3 that Jesus' siblings, his brothers, don't believe in him, and they're sort of castigating him, and they're taunting him, and they say, look, why don't you go back down into Judea, to Jerusalem, so that your disciples also may see works you're doing there. And of course, some disciples clearly are in Judea. And so Jesus ends up going to the festival, but he goes, according to verse 10, his brothers have gone up, and then he also went up, not publicly, but in private, because it's now the middle of the feast. He goes up without fanfare. And of course, our author, who is a disciple, is able to comment on this because he was there. So it was private to the crowds, but not private to him. And then you get all the events that happened at the Feast of Tabernacles, the controversy with the blind man, where the disciples who are there ask, did this guy sin or did his parents sin that caused him to be born blind? And Jesus says, no, of course not. And so there's all that stuff. Again, the disciples play a role there, and our author, of course, being a disciple and eyewitness, can share the account of what happened on this occasion. Then they go and leave Jerusalem again at the end of chapter 10, and what happens is they get word that Lazarus is sick. And of course, our author is with Jesus and the other disciples, and a note comes from the sisters that that Lazarus is sick, nearly to the point of death. And in chapter 11, verse 7, it says that Jesus said to his disciples, actually, he first stayed in where he was. He didn't go to Judea right away, but then he turns to his disciples and says, let's go back into Judea. And the disciples, by this point along their journeys, because they've been to Jerusalem a couple of times, it's very dangerous. And a bunch of disciples say, if we go there, they're just going to kill you, meaning kill all of us. So they've already tried to stone him a couple of times. So why would we want to go back down there? And then Jesus has to tell them, look, Lazarus has died. And he challenges the disciples to go with him. And of course, Thomas famously says to his fellow disciples, let's go. And they all go. Okay, so they go back down to Judea. On the backside of the Mount of Olives is where Bethany is, where Lazarus got sick and died and purportedly was raised from the dead. Okay, so they're going back toward Jerusalem, and it's nearly the Feast of Passover, which will be the final feast that Jesus attends. Okay, so this is the journey where they all go, and then you have Palm Sunday and so on. Then they go down into Jerusalem, and look what it says in chapter 12, verse 16. This is after Jesus has come down on the donkey. It says his disciples didn't understand these things at the first, right? Because our author is among these disciples. He can say this. But you don't get this kind of a statement in the other Gospels, not like this, because this is a personalized statement from the author. But when Jesus was glorified, then the disciples remembered. Notice, just talking now about the whole group of disciples, that these things had been written about him and had been done to him. Okay, another claim from the author to have inside knowledge of the disciples because, of course, he himself is a disciple and an eyewitness. There then follows that long scene, much of the rest of the gospel, in the upper room before the crucifixion, where the disciples get their feet washed and Judas there's the announcement of Judas's betrayal and so on. And this is the first time where we get introduced to the person who's called the beloved disciple in chapter 13, verse 23. Gets really interesting now, by the way. One of his disciples, whom Jesus loved, that's the beloved disciple, was reclining at the table at Jesus' side. And so Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking when he had just announced somebody was going to betray him. And that disciple, leaning back into Jesus, said to him, "Lord, who is it?" And Jesus said, "It is he to whom I'll give the morsel of bread I've dipped." But keep in mind, this is all very subtle. This is very private. Peter has just simply motioned to the disciple. It's not something the rest of the disciples presumably are picking up on. It's more subtle than that. But this other disciple, again, notice, he's not named. It's like that first disciple way back beside the Jordan River who was with Andrew, except he's called the one whom Jesus loved. But otherwise, he's not named. But he knows what's going on. And Peter, who clearly has the prominent role of all the disciples in this gospel, Peter is clearly is sort of the center of the main action that's going on among the disciples, even in this gospel. It's not as though our author is pretending that our author is at the center of everything. Here, he plays a fairly minor role, but it's something only he would know because it was Peter motioning to him. That's the point. Again, the author claiming to be an eyewitness to these events as they unfold. Then, of course, Jesus is arrested after this upper room scene. There's a lot of discussions up in the upper room we won't go into that our author is claiming to be privy to. But look at what it says in chapter 18, verse 1, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples. Again, they're accompanying him, totally unprecedented in the other gospels that you get this kind of constant reference to the disciples going along with him and present with him, because of course it puts our author into the scene. Across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. And so our author is there for the arrest. And then our author and Peter, look at verse 15 after the arrest. It says, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. But now notice, it doesn't say here the disciple whom Jesus loved, but it is yet again an example where you have two disciples, one of them named, the other unnamed, playing a role, but always kind of a side role, okay? Again, it's clearly the author, right? And since that disciple, this other disciple, who's not named here, was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter stood outside of the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door to bring Peter in. Now, none of the other evangelists tell us this is how Peter got in. Only this author tells us this is actually how Peter even got into the courtyard, because our author somehow knew people in the high priest household. Okay, we have no background to that, but they somehow knew. Were they relatives? We have no idea. And therefore, they were able to get into the courtyard. Okay? So they go into the courtyard, then there's the trial, and events happen there, and our disciple is there to witness a lot of it, just as Peter is. And then all this ends up going before Pilate, and Jesus ends up being crucified, right? And now in chapter 19, and this is so crucial, we're now coming to the climax of the book. These are the final events or scenes or episodes of the book itself. And all through the book, there's universal agreement among traditional, evangelical, critical, liberal, I don't care who you are, overwhelming consensus that the narrative of John is building toward the, quote, glorification, end quote, of Jesus. And the glorification of Jesus will take place in these climactic, dramatic events, his crucifixion, his resurrection at the close of the book, okay? So that's what's happening. It's very important to recognize we're now coming toward the end of the book, the climactic events of the book, okay? And at the cross, we're told in verse 26 of chapter 19, when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby. So there's our author again. He said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." He said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." From that hour, this disciple took her to his own home. So this disciple is now, the beloved disciple, our author is going to bear the burden of taking care of Mary. Remember, at this point, none of Jesus' siblings believe in Jesus or follow Jesus, but this disciple does. Also, maybe this disciple has some means. I mean, if he was known to the high priest household. I mean, maybe that suggests this disciple had some means that others didn't have. Who knows? It doesn't really matter. The point is, our author is at the crucifixion, is an eyewitness to the crucifixion, and there he is, the beloved disciple. And then it says at the end of that scene, after a few other things happen, where you get to Jesus' actual death, okay? The death of Jesus happens in verse 33. When they came to Jesus, they saw, it happened right before that. They saw that he was already dead, and therefore they didn't break his legs. And they end up not breaking his legs, but they pierce his side. And our author says this in verse 35, "He who saw it has borne witness." Now note the expression, "he who saw it." That's what the author claimed about himself way back at the signing on to the book. We, meaning the author, has beheld, has seen the glory of this Logos in human flesh. And so now as you get to the close of the book, remember what we said earlier, as you go to the end of a book, it's common for an author to sign off with references to themselves, clearer references to themselves, the nature of their work, their relationship to the work, and so on. So he has seen, or he saw, and he has borne witness. He is an eyewitness. This is his testimony. And his testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, of course, because he's the author. He can speak on behalf of himself, though he's writing of himself in the third person, no big deal. He wants the reader to believe that he, as an actual eyewitness and disciple, as he saw these things, he knows this is what actually happened. This was true. And it might have seemed mundane. I forgot to add this little detail in verse 36. It says, "For these things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled." The writing, actually, is what it says. The writing might be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. And again, another writing says, "They will look on him whom they've pierced." So our author wants to cite two writings from the Old Testament that are fulfilled by things that happened at the crucifixion, the glorification of Jesus. And he pauses to highlight that he is an eyewitness, his witness is true. But of course, notice what he's doing. The whole context is about writing and the truth and the fulfillment of the writings of the Old Testament. But our author, our disciple, our beloved disciple, is offering to you, the reader, another writing, which he is asserting is true, just like the writings from the Old Testament here. In other words, the whole context is about writing. That's why the author is referencing himself. He's connecting himself to the work that you are reading. Okay? This is authorship 101 among the classical authors in many ways. Not in every way, of course, but in many ways. Then what follows is the second major event of glorification, the resurrection of Jesus in chapter 20. And guess what happens? Verse 2, Mary ran and went to Simon after she saw the stone was rolled away from the tomb. She went to Simon Peter and guess what? The other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. Not named, but again, another disciple. Once again, we have an example, two disciples, one's named, one's not. And the other one is, of course, the author. One is the named guy. And they go and they see the grave clothes, and we get in verse 8 the exact reaction of this disciple. The other disciple who had reached the tomb first went in, and he saw and he believed. And note that expression again, he saw and he believed, because remember, at the beginning of our book, our author was identified as the one who had seen, had beheld the glory of Jesus. And this is just, again, validating his connection to the actual event. All right. And then you have Jesus appearing to all the disciples. Well, actually, he appears to Mary. And then in verse 18, it says Mary, Magdalene, went and announced, guess what? To the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." So our author was among those who heard Mary when she came and told this event. That's why this disciple knows what happened when Mary came back, because she came and told the disciples what had happened. So he knows the scene in the garden where Jesus appears to her. And then that night, verse 19, the first day of the week, the doors being locked, where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them. Our disciple, our author, is among them. He knows that Jesus has appeared to them alive. He's seen him now for the first time. But guess what? Thomas wasn't there. Our author can speak for that, right? He's in the room. Thomas wasn't there. And obviously these disciples told Thomas, look at verse 25. The other disciples told Thomas, we've seen the Lord. Again, note the expression, we have seen, because our author is one who has seen. But Thomas refused to believe them. Okay, he didn't believe their testimony, and he waited a week, and eventually Jesus came back the next week and appeared in the presence of the disciples with Thomas, and then Thomas came to believe. All right, and after that climactic moment, the one of the climactic key moments of the book, the appearances of Jesus to show he is alive for the very first time to this collection of disciples, we get this statement from the author. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples. Notice the expression, in the presence of his disciples, because you know what? Our author is among that group, okay? Which are not, in other words, the author is identifying himself in the group, which are not written in this book, okay? This is the author talking about his own book, his writing. But he already started to do that, didn't he? A little bit at the end of chapter 19, where the crucifixion scene happened as we got toward the end of the book. But these are written. The author has chosen to write these into the book, these events, these signs that are offered in the book, so that you, the reader, might believe. And it's an explicit comment about authorship from our beloved disciple who has been eyewitness to all these events right on through the book, okay? Putting so much emphasis on his connection to the events and the disciples' connection. Then we get one more story. After these things, Jesus revealed himself again, and no, you just almost could predict it, to the disciples. And our disciple is here. And now it gets a little more interesting. We're getting toward the end of the book. It was by the Sea of Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee, and he reveals himself in this way. Now, first of all, keep in mind, this is, I'll get to that in the appendix. All right. Simon Peter, these are the people who are there. Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Didymus, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together. So guess what? Our author is among this group. Okay? Now, it could be that our author is among these 2 other of his disciples, okay, that are unnamed. That's perfectly plausible, okay? That's been a pattern through the book, okay? I have no objection if you want to take that view. So it could be our author is among these 2 disciples. It's also possible our author is in one of these other groups. It could be our author is one of these other disciples who are named. And I would just point out that one of the groups here, or a part of the group, are the sons of Zebedee. That's James and, guess what? John. Okay? So if in fact our author is, as virtually all of the early testimony external evidence suggests, is John the son of Zebedee. Now, I didn't really talk about which John it was. Okay? Some people think it's John the son of Zebedee. Some think it's the Elder John. And people have different views, and if you haven't noticed, I'm not even taking a real strong stance on that, just that the author's name is John, and he is an eyewitness, and he was a real disciple of Jesus. That's the claim. But most of the testimony, overwhelmingly, I think it's actually really strong. Others disagree, okay? But would say it was John the son of Zebedee. So in this case, our author would be naming himself in a much more clearer way. In fact, it'd be more like the way Tacitus identified himself when he said he was writing about Agricola, who was his father-in-law. So, meaning that identified him as the son-in-law. So it could be that if you already think John the son of Zebedee wrote it, you would think this is actually the author naming, putting his name, he's a son of Zebedee, into the book. Your son of Zebedee was like your last name. It's naming yourself. So all that to say, if in fact this is the author, then the people who say this gospel is completely anonymous are just factually wrong. All right? Now, our disciple is here. There's the miracle of the catching of the fish, the 153 fish. I guess he was there to count them, knew the number. And then, of course, there's a conversation with Peter we won't go into. The main focus of this chapter is not on the beloved disciple. It's on Peter and Peter's future. At one point, Peter is informed by Jesus he's going to be martyred. And so Peter turned and saw this disciple whom Jesus loved, our author, following them, and he said to Jesus, by the way, note in verse 20, it says, the one who also leaned back against him during the supper and said, Lord, who is it that's going to betray you? The author, in other words, doesn't want you to forget he is the author, and he's been an eyewitness disciple to these key events. And then Peter says, what about this guy? Is the beloved disciple, is he going to be martyred as well, or what's his future? And Jesus responds to it, which is basically none of your business. Okay? And then it says this in verse 24, this is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things. Okay, note first of all, the express statement. It could not be clearer. This is the disciple, okay, the beloved disciple, who, present tense, mind you, is, because he's offering you his book, is bearing witness. Okay, he has seen these things. He is an eyewitness. Again, notice we're at the end of the book. This is signing off on the book. It's the normal place you expect the author to come back and reference himself, the nature of his work and his connection to the work. He's just being more explicit than he was earlier in the book. But Polybius does the same thing. So do some other authors. He is bearing witness about these things, and who has written these things. Remember, this is almost the exact statement Thucydides made about himself, where he said, Thucydides, who wrote these things. It's nearly the exact, it's certainly a synonymic meaning in Greek. It's almost the exact same Greek, but there's a couple synonyms here. Anyway, so again, no controversy about Thucydides. There's definitely no controversy here about this author, that this beloved disciple, it was an eyewitness, and this disciple wrote these things, meaning wrote the book, okay? And we know, and now notice, one of the final statements of the book from the author, he reverts back to what is a slightly more formal expression of identifying himself, the first person plural, just exactly like Thucydides, first person plural. We know that his testimony is true, which of course he's already stated previously in the book. This final emphasis on his own eyewitness testimony, which he offers to us, the readers. And then he says this, now, there are also many other things that Jesus did, which if every one of them were to be written, because he's chosen to write only certain things, I suppose, and now note that little expression, I suppose. Do you remember that? That's exactly what Thucydides said in his prologue. He used that little colloquial expression, exact same Greek word, ime, where Thucydides suddenly dropped into this kind of little I shouldn't say colloquial expression, I should say an interjection, I guess is what you'd call it. Anyway, it's the same thing. I suppose that the word itself could not contain the books that could be written. Again, the author signing off about his work. There, I know that took a while. Let's take a look at the way Dr. Bart Ehrman, how he reads particularly the final verses, and I think he comments on chapter 19. Now, Dr. Ehrman's is, a first-rate scholar. He was a textual critic originally, trained as a textual critic, and a very, very good one. And I've read a number of his stuff on textual criticism, and think it's a lot of it is very, very good. Most of it is very, very good. I mean, he's way above me, so I'm no place to judge him, really, I guess. And but he's branched out into a broader sort of early Christian, perspective, not just on textual criticism. And of course, he was a Christian growing up, and he's now identifies, I think, as an agnostic atheist. I think I get that right. And I think it's very helpful to hear how he looks at it. He's very sharp. He's very clear. And he writes a blog. He has a blog. And now this isn't a formal article, but he's written quite a bit in his blog about this. I'm going to give you some selections. All right, so the blog post, as you see, is from November 14th, 2014. And I'll put a link, in the blog to the blog post, or to his blog. Now, he says, I've started a series of posts dealing with the authorship of the Gospels, specifically why they were eventually named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. My first point in my previous post, and in this one, is that the books are completely anonymous. I referenced that earlier. And of course, I've already just pointed out, it may be actually that the Gospel of John is not anonymous. I actually don't think it is, but some people might say, yeah, John wrote it. He was the claim is that John wrote it, the beloved disciple, but it may have been John the Elder and not John the son of Zebedee. And so in that case, it would be, the name of the person would not be in the book. Their authors never divulge their names. Eventually, I may want to address a question about this later and so on. Now, he says, I pointed out yesterday that even though the author of Luke does not tell us his name, he does write in the first person, we, in the opening of his gospel. That never happens in either Matthew or Mark, which is true. But it does happen again in the Gospel of John. In fact, it's widely claimed, sometimes even by scholars who should know better. We'll come back to that statement. That the author identifies himself as the beloved disciple who appears several times in the Gospel of John and only in this gospel. On a number of occasions, the author of the gospel refers to the disciple whom Jesus loved. This person is generally known as the beloved disciple. Who is he? Where and did he write the gospel? And so on. Okay, and then I can't remember if you're going to see the text I'm looking at, but if so, I've crossed out some things just to make sure I don't read them because they're not important. There's no problem with them. I actually agree with everything you see crossed out. So for now, I want to deal with the question of whether this author of the book is claiming to be the disciple. Okay, so is the author of the Gospel of John actually claiming to be the disciple, the beloved disciple? Now, there are two passages, says Ehrman, that readers have typically taken to indicate that, in fact, this is what the author is claiming. Now, of course, we just went through the whole book. We did not depend on two passages, but we took you through the whole book, so you could see how obvious it was. Okay, but Ehrman's right. A main focus ends up coming toward the end of the book for obvious reasons. Okay, the first is this one where Jesus is beside the cross, and Jesus is on the cross, and this beloved disciple is next to him, and he writes what we already read, which is, he who saw this has testified, so that you also may believe his testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth. And then Ehrman does something really kind of bizarre to me. He says that the final clause can also be translated as, quote, and there is one who notes, and there is one who knows that he tells the truth. Okay. Now, I'll say this is bizarre. I mean, that's putting it charitably. There is no doubt what the author wrote. He just wrote what is in the first thing, what's in the quotations that Ehrman gives when he says he knows that he tells the truth. Okay, the author is that's what he actually wrote, Takinos in Greek, I think it is. But this idea of there is one who, okay, what that is working yourself into a pretzel in order to try and say, hey, it may be that right here, our narrator is distancing himself from the beloved disciple. And if you give this alternative translation, we get a separate individual out of this who doesn't even seem to be mentioned. It's a way of not to be mentioned, but who gets differentiated. I see. Now listen, Ehrman does not explain why exactly he gives this alternative translation. I'm telling you, I have no idea because it's so bizarre, but I believe that's what he's trying to do. And if anyone thinks I'm wrong about that, by all means, correct me in the comments section. But I'm just telling you flat out, this is okay. I'll stop. This is bad. I'll just stop right there. The author then differentiates between the disciple whom Jesus loved, who saw and testified to seeing blood and water come out of Jesus' side, and the audience, you who may believe. Okay, well, yeah, I think that's true. There's the writer, there's the beloved disciple, the writer, and then there's the audience, for sure. But it's important to note, he says, the author does not speak in the first person here. Okay. He does not indicate that he himself is this disciple. So this is not a passage in which the author claims to be the beloved disciple. He instead is someone who has heard the testimony of the beloved disciple, and whether he heard it directly from the disciple or in some other way is something he does not indicate. Again, hopefully you can see all this was crossed out. I don't know if you'll be looking at the same thing I am, but either way, you could read it if you want. I don't disagree with anything in this next paragraph, but all I can say is I just don't follow that conclusion at all. I mean, we've already well established, we looked at the greatest historian of the classical world. We're going to skip ahead now to the next chapter. In reference to this beloved disciple, the verse says, By the way, I just hope you get, at this point, if you followed me this long, you know it's totally irrelevant that the author doesn't speak of himself in the first person. I hope you know that by having yourself read Thucydides with me at the beginning of this video. Then comes the key verse, chapter 21, verse 24. In reference to this beloved disciple, the verse says, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them. And we know that his testimony is true." All right, so Ehrman says, this verse is widely taken to mean that the author, the one who, quote, has written, end quote, these things, is in fact the beloved disciple. Right, because I would say it's obvious at this point. Notice the disciple is the one who testifies and wrote these things, and we know that it's true. Right, because that's normal to say that, to speak that way. Who is the we? Well, obviously it's the author and those with him. Okay, yeah, that sort of makes sense. But now he's differentiating them. There he is. Yeah, the author differentiates between him and the beloved disciple and us, the author. So I understand this then, that Ehrman is accepting the we or the us as referring to the author of the book. But he says it's not the beloved disciple because the beloved disciple is in the third person singular. Wrong conclusion. That's clearly wrong. Okay? So the author is decidedly not claiming to be the disciple, the beloved disciple. Now, by the way, let me ask this question, if I may colloquially. What the heck is he referencing them for then? What's the point of referencing him? Okay. All right. Instead, he is indicating that the beloved disciple, whoever he was, wrote some of the things that he observed. Well, that's not what it says. It doesn't say he wrote down some of the things that he observed. It says he wrote these things. It was nearly the exact expression Thucydides used, as I said. He wrote these things. That is the book. And it's very surprising to me, frankly, that so many scholars who, and I quote, should know better, end quote, read it that way. What this means then is that the Gospel of John does discuss this shadowy figure, the unnamed beloved disciple, but does not identify himself with him or speak of him using the first person pronoun. When the author does use the first person pronoun, it's precisely to differentiate himself. No, it's not. It's to identify himself as the beloved disciple. So once again, we have a completely anonymous book. Yeah, so that's right. I'll just say sort of the back to our original thing. Authors identify themselves at the beginning and end of their work. That's the normal thing, to sign on or sign off from your work, by identifying yourself. And or the nature of your work, and or your connection to the work. Okay? That's the norm. So an ancient reader is going to expect that. And in the Gospel of John, we got exactly that. At the beginning, a reference to the author and their connection to the work. Eyewitness, they saw these things, they're a disciple. And then, as the work unfolded, describing themselves, just as Thucydides does, by the way, multiple times throughout his work. He was a general, for crying out loud. He fought in the war and regularly refers to himself, but numerous times refers to himself in his account in the third person, okay, singular. And then, so that's all normal. And here, as we come to the end of the work, we can see that our author is slowly making it clearer and clearer that they are the beloved disciple. And when you get to the very end, it's crystal clear because they just flat out say, this is the one who testifies and has written these things. And we know that his testimony is true, and all that is a perfectly normal way to speak, third person singular, and then first person plural, about themselves, exactly as Thucydides does. And then even in that little interjection, to make the state, to use the expression, I suppose, ime, exactly as Thucydides does in his prologue. All right, so let me be clear about something. The way Ehrman reads the Gospel of John and its statements about authorship are really common, right? This is the normal way many scholars read it, okay? And I really mean this. I absolutely believe Christians drink the Kool-Aid and they're sniffing mushrooms. Okay, I mean, both sides have things like this that I think are embarrassing. Both sides. Okay, unless you think I'm being too hard on Ehrman, I really do highly respect him generally as in his scholarships, particularly his text critical work. But he gets a lot of mileage out of saying, look, the literacy rates were so bad, and it's well established how bad they were. I think the estimates are way too low myself, but nonetheless, they were low for sure compared to nowadays. It's not even likely John the son of Zebedee even ever, really, it's so improbable that he really couldn't even have written the book. Now, of course, John the Elder could have written the book, so that's a different person. He wouldn't have been a fisherman. That's who Bauckham argues wrote the book, and some others. But I actually don't really find this very persuasive at all. I mean, good grief, we have hundreds and hundreds of letters from Roman soldiers who were hardly elite, educated people who could write. And so I think an apostle, this is my view, an apostle whose life charge from his master was to devote the entirety of his life to proclaiming the message of his master, of Jesus, was highly incentivized to learn how to write and create written forms of communicating that message. I think that doesn't mean it did happen. I'm just saying that easily balances the improbability of someone who grew up a fisherman. Of course, our fisherman, if it's the son of Zebedee, it turns out is connected to the high priest household. And maybe he's not quite as poor as we, or maybe his family connections aren't as poor as we think. I have no idea, but it doesn't matter. He moved out of Judea, wherever he was raised. He moved out of Judea and ended up in a totally different part of the world, for sure. We have plenty of evidence that he moved to Ephesus, and so he could easily have learned later. Let me tell you, there were a lot of teachers in the ancient world looking to make a buck off of somebody who wanted to learn how to read and write in Greek. So anyway, that's my response to it. And again, most of the time, I'm really not trying to respond to Ehrman particularly, but more the general view, and he just sort of encapsulated it very, very well. Now, the conclusion then, I think, is pretty obvious. The non-traditional views are, I think, convoluted, labored, and honestly, near conspiratorial. Okay? That's what I think. Now, if you're a skeptic, there is no reason you should accept Ehrman and their group's reading of John. And let me tell you why. You can believe what the vast, as far as I know, everybody, I'm not aware of anyone who didn't read it, the book in the traditional way. The way we went through it and read it, as far as I know, anyone I've ever read through history, not just the earliest commentators of John, that's their reading, okay? Only in the modern critical period have there been these sort of convoluted theories. Now, if you reject the convoluted theories and just accept that the beloved disciple is the one being claimed as the author and book of the book, is an eyewitness, and so on, that does not mean, as a skeptic, you just have to believe everything, obviously, right? You could easily maintain your skepticism at that point. You could claim the whole thing's a forgery, or you could claim whatever, okay? You could claim there's only a kernel of truth, and this disciple has embellished all these stories. There was nothing supernatural, and so on. You could claim all that while still holding to the traditional authorship. So I see no reason from your skepticism to be resistant to what's an obvious reading internally of the narrative of the book, okay? So I think you'd be wiser to dump the convoluted theories. Now, the appendix. I'd like to focus on just the final chapter. Is it a later edition? Did the same author add it later, or did some other author add it later? Okay, so there's debate, a lot of debate about this. And let me start by saying there's not a single manuscript that presents us with the Gospel of John as anything other than the chapters 1 to 21, the copies we have. So there's no textual criticism to lead us in this direction. The other thing I would say is that the most sort of weighty aspect of why people think John 21 was added is because they say, look at the end of chapter 20. There was already an ending to the book, and therefore we don't need chapter 21. that was probably added later. It's superfluous, essentially. But plus, Jesus was already raised from the dead and already appeared to his disciples. But I would say, if you just really paid attention as we went through the book, it's pretty clear that the end of chapter 20, the resurrection scenes, are indeed a statement about the authorship of the book, but not only about that. And it's not quite the full disclosure that the author is claiming exactly and precisely and explicitly to be the beloved disciple. I think it's already clear, but they haven't actually quite made that claim directly yet. Okay, so there is something added at the end of the book. And I think it's Bauckham who does a good job of showing sort of the relationship between those two endings, and I highly recommend his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, where he goes into many other good arguments too, as well as Simon Gathercall's work on Are the Gospels Anonymous, too. Really good balance, I think, to some of the stuff that you get from the critical scholars. But let's just take a look real quick then at chapter 21. It begins with the phrase, after these things. That's the actual Greek, metatauta, which, guess what, is a really common expression in the Gospel of John, chapters 1 to 20, to differentiate the beginnings of new sections. You can look it up for yourself. There's plenty of examples. This is usually the author's marker for a brand new section. Okay, it's not the only marker; it's a common marker. So that's the first indication. We just have our author adding an epilogue of a final event. The second thing then is the Greek style is the same. The vocabulary is similar. The grammar and the syntax are the same. There's no indication in the style of the Greek that we have anything other than just the same author writing. In fact, there's even a signature trait. There's a guy did his doctorate, I think it was, on this trait, and it's a fairly complex syntactical trait. In chapter, it's used in chapter 12, and then again it's used in chapter 21, where it says, "This he said, signifying by what death he would glorify God." And again, it's this where you throw up a demonstrative pronoun in the neuter singular, this, and then you add the participle with the words signify, simenon, or some other participle, and then you have the verb. I won't go into the whole thing. You can read his work if you want to, but it is a stylistic trait. It's only used, I think it's used 3 or 4 times in John, but it is used in chapter 21, and it doesn't appear in any of the other of the other three, the synoptic evangelists. So there's nothing, I think, nothing from the Greek style to suggest we should have a different author or think that it was added later. The appearance, there's only one appearance, right, of Jesus in the sort of the resurrected state in this chapter. It's one story, but and it's staged as a special event, of course. We list all the disciples. We're up in Galilee. It's clearly at a later time because it's on the Sea of Galilee. And it's unlike in chapter 20, where all of the appearances are the first time that people came to discover Jesus is alive. In chapter 21, it has nothing to do with people realizing for the first time that Jesus is alive. They already believe he's alive. They know he's alive. They've already seen him now, some of them multiple times. This appearance has nothing to do with demonstrating he's alive. That's why it's separate. That's why it's an epilogue. It has to do with the future role of the disciples, their role as fishermen. Remember, Jesus said they would fish people, not just fish. They'd become fishermen of people. And then also shepherds. So they uses 2 of their occupations as metaphors for their role going forward after his departure. All right? And then, of course, we have the climactic scene of identifying the author explicitly as the beloved disciple who is testifying and has written these things for everyone. So all those are reasons why to see chapter 21 as a closure to the main progression of the narrative. But there's one other thing. And to see it, you really have to know something about the structure of John. We'll look at a few verses, and then I'll just pull up the map so you can see it. You get the introduction to the book, which is all the stuff that happens before the main body of the book. You get what you call the prologue or the introduction to the book. All right. And the main body of the book begins in chapter 2 and verse 13, where there's a holiday for the Jews. And the holiday is Passover. And Jesus goes up to Jerusalem for the occasion of the holiday. And he spends time at the holiday. It says, I'll read the verse to you, the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. That's verse 13, chapter 2. He spends his time at the holiday. He goes back to Galilee. We kind of covered this already, so we're not going to talk about it in any other way other than what we've just said. Then guess what? Chapter 5, after they've gone back to Galilee, we have another reference. Chapter 5, verse 1, to a holiday. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So now we have the second major part of the book, the second major feast. It's a holiday. Jesus goes up to Jerusalem for the holiday. In chapter 6, he's back in Galilee. Feeds the 5,000. Chapter 7, guess what? Verse 2 says, now the Jews' feast of booths, of tabernacles, was at hand. And in verse 10, Jesus went up to the feast. So now we get the third major section of the book, Jesus' visit to Jerusalem on the occasion of this holiday, yet another holiday, this time Tabernacles and Dedication, which happened in the fall. And then in chapter 11, we get the beginning of the Lazarus story, which leads into Jesus' visit to Jerusalem, and the Passover feast, which covers chapters 11 to 20, and that's the rest, almost the rest of the book, until you get to the epilogue in chapter 21. So there you go. You have 6 major parts to the book. You have the introduction, the prologue, and then you have 4 main visits to the city of Jerusalem for the occasion of holidays, and then the return trips to Galilee, and then you have the epilogue at the end of the book. Okay? So all told, you have 6 parts to the book. Okay? Now that seems pretty obvious. It's David Gooding who first pointed that out, to my knowledge, and I think it's the simplest way to read the narrative structure of the book. Now, if in fact that's John's own compositional architecture of the book, I want you to notice something. That the first half of the book then would be at the end of the second feast. You have the introduction and then the 2 feasts. And then that would be 3 parts, 3 sections. And then you'd have 3 more sections to go, the last 2 visits for the holidays, and then the epilogue, okay? So if that is, in fact, the structure of the book, which it appears to be, I didn't mention, by the way, I don't even think David Gooding, that I'm aware of, mentions this. Maybe he does, but I've never seen it from him. But at the end of each of the sections of these 6 sections, we're told of somebody who comes to believe in Jesus. So that's another little sort of closure to each of the sections. But if you just look at it in 2 halves, okay, the end of the first half of the book then would be the end of the 3rd section, which is chapter 6. And guess what? It's a story at the Sea of Galilee. Now, you might think that's common, but it's not in John. In the first part of the book, this is the first story to take place at the Sea of Galilee. Okay? The first half of the book, it's the first story. It's the only story to take place at the Sea of Galilee. And it's in the end of the first half of the book, chapter 6, where Jesus feeds, listen to what he does. He feeds the 5,000 with bread and fish. And then he preaches a sermon, and then he has a conversation with Peter at the end of that story. All right? Now, go to the second half of the book. Guess what? There are no stories at the Sea of Galilee. None. Until you come to the very end of the book and the epilogue. At the very end of the book, you have our second story that takes place at the Sea of Galilee. So only 2 stories in the whole book occurring at the Sea of Galilee, both of which occur at the end of their respective halves of the book. There are 2 halves of the book, okay? And guess what happens at the Sea of Galilee, the Sea of Tiberias, at the end of the book? Well, let's see. Jesus feeds his disciples bread and fish. And then he has a conversation with Peter. Okay? The exact same kind of scene we had at the end of chapter 6, the first half of the book. Okay? So again, if you're looking at the structure of the book, how John seems to have created the architecture of the book's narrative, there are 2 halves. And the end of each half takes place, the only stories in the whole book, taking place at the Sea of Galilee on occasions where Jesus fed people with bread and fish and had a conversation with Peter. So again, it's just a structural reason then to think that indeed the author had that epilogue as part of his original compositional architecture. So the final conclusion then is that the traditional authorship, I think, works really, really well, and the other views, the modern critical whatever position, is convoluted, labored, and as I said, some of the views are nearly conspiratorial. I'll put links again to the relevant resources. Look forward to hearing people's response. Hope I get some good responses. I really hope some people point out what if they think I've gotten Thucydides wrong, because that would have a huge bearing on how I'm reading John. And also if I have in any way misrepresented Ehrman, please make sure you specify that. Be very precise. I do not in any way want to have communicated what I thought he meant, and I simply get that wrong. So look forward to hearing from you.